Brother, in the sermonette, Mr. Phelps in the sermonette brought to you a definition or two, and I'd like to begin the message this morning in that way. I'd like to begin by bringing you a definition, and my intent is really twofold. Certainly I'd like you to have a more precise understanding of the term that I'm going to present, but I'd also like you to keep the concept in mind of what we're talking about here, and ask ourselves why we should be interested, what it means to us, this particular term. According to dictionary.com, a role model, that's the term we're going to think about, at least through this message, and bounce into and off of. A role model is a person whose behavior, example, or success is or can be emulated by others, especially by younger people. A role model, and we've heard of role models, we've seen them, we know that many people have said, hey, I don't want to be a role model, so I'll live as wild and crazy as I like, and you guys should not be judging me for what I do. We've seen some of our professional athletes respond that way. But World English Dictionary says that a role model is a person regarded by others, especially younger people, so we see that referenced several times, as a good example to follow. All right, a good example to follow. One last source, this is from the American Heritage Dictionary, and it has a little bit more complete explanation and definition here. It says, a person who serves as an example of the values, here's where I think we start to see a little bit more depth in it, the example of the values, attitudes, and behaviors associated with a role. It goes on to say, for example, a father is a role model to his sons. Role models can also be persons who distinguish themselves, and again, we see some pretty valuable, pretty heavy words here, meaningful words. A person who distinguishes themselves in such a way that others admire and want to emulate them. For example, someone who overcomes poverty to become a successful brain surgeon or airline pilot can be described as a role model for others who find themselves starting from those similar circumstances. So hold that thought, brethren. As I finish this introduction, as we go through the message today, hold that thought of a role model, somebody's example, somebody's values and attitudes that we might want to emulate, and the reasons that we would do that. I found myself recently reading through the late chapters of the book of Genesis, and I came across the meandering story of the life of Joseph. And as I reviewed some of the scenarios that I had heard and read and studied so often, and sometimes spoken on myself, I realized just how germane, just how applicable and appropriate they are for our lives. How closely, in fact, they fit with some of the lessons that I have learned down through time, and in fact, I'm still learning today. I use the term in there, lessons that we can learn, and lessons are defined as something learned by study or experience. I want to repeat that because we recognize there's three pieces really. There's something to be learned. That thing can be positive or negative, and we can learn it by study of our own or something that we experience. And as each of us grow older, brethren, we learn many experiences. We learn many lessons. We see things, we hear things, we experience things ourselves that become part of who we are, and they mold our character and shape our personalities. And when I can learn from somebody else's success or failure, I consider that a gift. There's not enough time for me to do it all. And some of those things we learn are indeed painful, dangerous even sometimes. And so those are the ones that I most like to learn by seeing someone else having succeeded or failed at them. And if I can learn from that, I consider that a gift. The pages of our Bible are full of examples, full of lessons, full of role models. And as we look through some of those pages and read through some of the stories, we can see how someone conquered a city or conquered their temper. We can see how someone saved a life or controlled their tongue. We can see how someone administered justice or showed mercy, and how someone developed a gift, developed a talent, and then used it on behalf of others, as we heard in the first message, the Samaritan, who recognized a value and a necessity and a need, and pushed himself outside that comfort zone to serve another one, to show outgoing concern, to practice love in a real physical hands-on application. Further, when we consider the life of Joseph, perhaps the greatest thing that we can come away with is that his lifetime is filled with incredible extremes, and yet he never lost his focus on God. Life, we know, can be like that. It can be a roller coaster of sorts. And life, if it were smooth, and we like that sometimes, wouldn't have its ups if it didn't have its downs. It's by contrast that we recognize the things that are exciting and admired and desired, by contrasting them with the things that are less admired and less desired. So we know that sometimes as God puts us through our roller coaster of life that we don't understand, or perhaps we don't appreciate while we're in the moment. Today I'd like to take a closer look at some of the many lessons that we learn from this biblical character, and I've entitled my sermon, Modeling Joseph. Modeling Joseph, and that brings us back to the concept of the role model and the values and the attitudes and the experience and the character of somebody that we want to emulate. And when we look at it, actually, you'll be, I'm sure, going through some of the things in your mind, and very often when we see these larger-than-life characters, we say, well, I don't rise to that. You know, we'll see how he was mugged, he was thrown in prison, he was sold into slavery, and we don't see those extremes in our life. But if we bring them down just a little bit, we start to see how our lives truly do align in certain ways with the things we've gone through, the trials that we've had, the successes that we've had, how we can teach our children, how we can set examples for those around us. And the question is, as we look into the pages of the Bible and we see those role models, sometimes good and sometimes bad, can we recognize that our lives mirror them maybe a little closer than we first think, and that our lives indeed can be a role model for others as well? And if we're not quite as strong on the role model scale as we should be, we know we have opportunity to change and to grow and to improve, so that we then indeed can be looked to somebody, or looked to by somebody who maybe starts by those same similar scenarios and circumstances as we did. We have people that are coming to church that are new, that are asking some of those first initial questions that we did, is, what does the Sabbath mean? What am I allowed to do? Why can't I eat pork? So when they look at our lives, when they hear our explanations, when they hear us tell about, well, I used to, and you know what, I changed, and I've had to overcome, and you go to a party and all there is pepperoni pizza, and how do you respond, and what's the real application of life? And we become a role model to those individuals. So let's turn and look at some of the lessons that we can learn as we model Joseph, or mirror Joseph perhaps. Lesson number one, again, as I've stated earlier, is that life is a roller coaster, and because of that, it requires perseverance. So you could write roller coaster / perseverance as the first thing that we're going to learn from Joseph. And actually, this first point is going to have several subpoints, because we're going to weave our way through that meandering story to refresh our memory of some of the things that he's gone through. Again, on the high side and on the low side, and recognize how he persevered and how he shines as a role model to us. And if you look at the relationships you have, if you look at the various trials that you've faced in life, sometimes we bring them upon ourselves, sometimes they do come from an outside source. If we recognize that and say, okay, maybe not to the same degree as Joseph, but really, you know what, I can slot in things I've experienced at every one of those highs and lows that he's had, and recognize that I have myself persevered through many of those same type of ups and downs. And brethren, we ourselves gain strength by that, and as we share that, not out of a, pat myself on the back type of thing, but when somebody asks, we share our experience, our example shines as a role model that they then strive to use as an opportunity to grow. Again, we can look at the many obvious lessons of Joseph's life, and we see that he's got incredible triumphs, and he also endures some hellacious lows. And he comes through it all, persevering as one of the premium heroes of our Bible. Let's go to point number one. We're going to pick it up in Genesis chapter 37, and again, we'll meander through about 3 chapters here, in 3 or more chapters rather, in Genesis. But in Genesis chapter 37, we pick it up in verse 3, and we see at this point, really, it's early in Joseph's life, and we see that he's on top of the world. When you're a teenage guy and you live in the protection of home, and you're young, you feel 10 foot tall and bulletproof, and certainly our ladies could feel the same way. I mean, you're at some of your physical peak. We really pay attention to how we look and how we dress. We've got life laid out in front of us as an opportunity. Joseph at this point was really on top of the world. Verse 3 says that Jacob dearly loved Joseph, and as a token of his affection, he gives Joseph that richly embroidered coat, which we often refer to as the coat of many colors. And so, when you were young, you had your very special, maybe, I remember that at 16, I bought a motorcycle, and I had that black leather jacket, and I'll tell you, I loved that jacket. I thought I looked cooler than Elvis, and now I look back at some of the pictures, and I have to smile because my vision was a little bit blurred at that point, apparently. But that was something special to me. And so Joseph looks at this and says, you know what? I've got my dad's ear. I've got my dad's eye. Life is good. I've got this special coat. It actually makes him feel a little puffed up and proud, which we know is not good, and yet he was kind of on top of the world. At this point, we can see that Joseph's life can be likened to that long uphill positive climb. At the beginning of the roller coaster, you hear the gears and the wheels all grinding away, and your blood pressure starts to climb a little bit, the excitement of what's going to come. But again, what we see is that things are good, and he doesn't yet know what life is going to hold. And yet things are good and they're exciting. We know that the favoritism and a couple of shared dreams have some bad blood percolating below the surface, but Joseph's life is pretty good to this point. But let's look at point number 2 here, because we see that he's about to take that first hard, gut-wrenching plunge in the roller coaster of life. I mentioned earlier that Joseph gets mugged, and that's apparently, or pretty precisely, what happens in point number 2. So you might just say point number 2. There'll be about a dozen of them in this first point. A good portion of the message will take us through simply the highs and lows. And what I'd like you to think about is, again, have you gone through something that you liken to this? Do you have somebody at the office, or somebody maybe when you were in the service, or somebody when you were in school or college that took advantage of what you did? You had somebody that was a supervisor that was particularly difficult on you. And you can look at that and say, that was a trial that I survived. That's a trial where I learned patience. That's a trial where, as the centurion said, I am a man under authority, and I recognize what that is. And therefore, maybe you've learned not to be the boss that is so difficult to live with. And so as we go through those trials, we learn, we make notes, we have mental memories that we tuck away to say, don't be that way. Take the higher road, be the better person. So we can all relate our experiences to all the different facets of Joseph's life. So point number 2 is that Joseph gets mugged by none other than his own brothers. The story tells us that Jacob's sons are off tending to the herds, and when Jacob directs Joseph to check on his brothers, he goes about doing that, and as his brothers see him coming, we see some of that bad blood that's been percolating. We see some of the anxiety and the bitterness that apparently has developed over time. So we're in Genesis chapter 37, beginning in verse 19. We'll read 19 and 20. And here the brothers say, look, this dreamer is coming. So again, he had dreams about how he was going to be in charge, and they would bow down to him, and so what seemed like arrogance on his part certainly had the brothers thinking less of him. And we see it here. Look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. So this is not just he irritates me. This is something that had really been burning in their gut, something that had really been bothering them. And so we see the animosity that's here. Let's kill him and cast him into some pit. And we'll tell everybody else, so now we're going to concoct a story to cover our trail. We'll say that some wild beast had devoured him. We shall see then what will become of his dreams. But we also see then that Jacob's oldest brother Reuben has a little bit of realism in his head, a little bit of recognition of just how far they were willing to go and the fact that they shouldn't go there. He says, let us not kill him. This is verse 21 and 22. Let us not kill him, shed no blood, but let's cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness. But don't lay a hand on him. So we begin to see, it doesn't come out and say that God was, but we begin to see that crowd mentality, that mob mentality was about to do an extreme activity. And God put at least into the mind of one of the brothers to say, guys, that's way out of line. And so again, the fact that we don't hear God's name, we so many times will through the story, but we see that God put that hand of protection. No, only going to go so far. What was the situation with Job? Satan said, yeah, but you've built this hedge around him. Just give me a crack at him. God says, okay, but only so far. And that's effectively what we see in the life of Joseph here as well. So when Joseph arrives, You can imagine that he's shocked. You know, he's walking up to bring a note from Dad and see how things are going, but instead he's attacked and he's stripped of his precious coat and he's lowered into a pit. You can read through that in verses 23 and 24. Again, I'm not going to go through all of the detail, but we'll hit the highlights and the lowlights as we go through here. So you can imagine, again, Joseph sitting there, and, you know, every set of brothers and sisters, you know, we've all wrestled, and we've, you know, you throw a hood over somebody and you mess with them, or you push them in a closet and you turn the lights off, and those gags and those pranks, they happen in a family. And you can imagine right now that Joseph is saying, as he's looking up out of this pit, okay guys, you know, all right, that was pretty funny, okay, you got me. But you know, as it's quiet, and as he maybe hears their murmuring up there that, yeah, he finally got what's coming to him, it starts to set in that he's hitting one of those low spots in his life. Really the first one that he's about to experience. Joseph must have become terrified as the reality of that began to set in. We can see that's the case later. If we were to jump to Genesis 42 and verse 21, it tells us a little bit about how his brothers spoke among themselves. So they've now grabbed him, they've thrown him in the pit, and they're really deciding what to do. You know, they had wanted to dispose of him in a permanent way, and Reuben says, no guys, we can't do that, but let's consider it. So in Genesis 42 and verse 21, it says, truly, we're guilty concerning our brother because we saw the distress. So they're thinking now later in the story, looking back on the fact of what they had done, and they said, we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, and yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us. So, you know, very often that happens when we do something and payback comes. We look at it and say, you know what, I got to be honest, I brought this on myself. Or I was responsible for something that happened to somebody else. And the brothers are reminiscing here. So we recognize just how fearful Joseph must have been at that point. Again, we recognize that it all could have ended right there with that mob mentality and truly a murder of a brother. And yet that didn't happen. God has greater plans for Joseph, and we see this young man instead sold into slavery by his brothers to a passing man. Verse 27 tells us that they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. And the margin of my Bible says that amounted to about $145. Now, $145 back then would have been, you know, pretty expensive, pretty good to have in your pocket jingling. But again, to sell a brother, to send them away not knowing what will happen, that's not much for flesh and blood. So in one quick turn, we see this first and second point of Joseph's life. We see a happy-go-lucky, blessed, protected, loving young man. Yes, perhaps a little proud and arrogant. Again, we've gone through that in our younger years. We see him go to a slave, probably bound and looking back at his brothers out of a cage perhaps, or tied behind a camel and walking off into the distance, looking over his shoulder at the faces of his brothers that he won't see for another 20 years. Imagine how bewildering, how unsettling that must have been for a young man who doesn't know what the future holds. The third point that you might put down is sold again. Because now he's sold for this 20 pieces of silver, and he starts this journey, and we don't know exactly how long it would have taken them to travel, how many other stops they had along the way. But continuing in Genesis, this time in verse 39 and verse 1, it says that after the caravan arrived in Egypt, the slave traders sold Joseph to a high officer of Pharaoh's court named Potiphar. Now, I turn to sometimes the commentaries as we go to understand better. And it says, Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary on this says the following about Genesis chapter 39 and verse 1. It says, God surely had a hand in Joseph being sold to Potiphar. So, you know, you've seen in movies something like, I can't think of the one that Russell Crowe was in, The Gladiator, you know, where they would bring in, you know, dozens or a whole caravan worth of slaves that they picked up in their travels, and they put them up on a stage and they sell them to the highest bidder. And so, you know, anything could have happened. But in the same way that we saw our God put his hand on Joseph's life earlier when his brothers restrained themselves, we see now through a turn of events that God continues to act in the life of Joseph. It says, God surely had a hand in Joseph being sold to Potiphar, in order that in the house of one so closely connected with the court, he might receive that precious training which was necessary for the high office he was destined to fill. And in the school of adversity, learn the lessons of practical wisdom that were to be of greatest utility and importance in his future career. So if you put yourself in the same situation, if you look at your life and say, you know, when has a blessing led to the fact that I was working for a particular person who maybe gave me the opportunity to travel? I worked for an individual that was incredibly generous, and they paid for my master's degree. And so, you know, I came from a family of 7. I was the first to ever go to college, and I worked hard to do that. But I would not have been able to afford, you know, that high level. It was the generosity of working for an individual that allowed me to do that. And so I can look at my life and say, you know what, I have seen connections in the same way that I can't take credit for. I have seen the providence of God's hand in my life. And so as we all think about our lives, we can see that type of thing. Sometimes the disasters that we see, or the trials that we see, the hard uphill grinds that we have through life, we look at on the other side of that hill and say, you know what, that was providence. That was a blessing. That was an opportunity. And it's launching me in a different direction, or to a different level than I would have done otherwise. And we get out on our knees and we thank God and we say, Father, I have the opportunity now to learn more, go more, do more, provide perhaps that same type of generosity to people later, because our lives have taken a turn and I see your hand, your blessing in it. Learning to trust God and learning one of those great lessons of life. And we see as Joseph goes through the highs and the lows that he constantly comes back to God. He gives him the credit. He recognizes and he sticks true to the things that he had learned and the life he knows he's to live. Point number 4. We talked about he's feeling good. He's going downhill with his brothers. He gets sold again. Now the reality of truly being a slave long term and working in a place as with that tag sets in. Point number 4 would be that things begin to look up for young Joseph. So now we see the bottom perhaps, and things start to turn the other way. We're in Genesis chapter 39 and verse 2. And here's the time that we start to see God's name specifically detailed as the impact that's taking part in Joseph's life. Genesis chapter 39 and verse 2, it says, "And the Lord was with Joseph." Positive thing. And again, we get down on our knees and we ask God to be with us. Give us the strength. Give us the insight. Give us the protection that we need. Give us the wisdom. Give us the discernment. Put your angels about us. Protect our children. The Lord was with Joseph. So he became a successful man. So again, you look at a situation here, wait a minute, I'm a slave. How do I become successful as a slave? We can go in to see. It says he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So we begin to see again God's direct intervention in his life and the fact that that was the source of his success. And we'll read more about what that is. Now again, if you imagine Joseph having arrived in the house, you know, he's the rookie, if you will. He's the new guy, and he's going to get the worst of the worst. You know, everybody's had to say, I've done my time. I've been here for 2 years or 5 years. And so you're mopping the floors, you're slopping the pigs, you're doing all the heavy lifting. And that would have been his role typically. And yet, because God is keeping his fingers on the pulse of Joseph's life, he guides things in such a way that his personality, his respect, his humility, his logic, all comes to play, and that this Egyptian, Potiphar, his owner, starts to say, wait a minute, I recognize something special about this kid as well. We can read through the story, and again, we won't go through all of it, but he was so effective in whatever menial jobs that Potiphar gave him and the group gave him to do, that he soon became a house servant, which is a step up from working out in the yard or the back 40, if you will. In Matthew chapter 25 and verse 21, Jesus taught about this principle of a master and his servant. So what we're going to see here, what we come to understand is Joseph recognized he had been taught these certainly by his father, and he had seen them work through his young life. And so he was working, he was bringing with him character and personality that would have been recognized by others. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 21 says, "And his master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things, and enter into the joy of your master.'" So we can look and turn to different scriptures and say, you know, we're told that we should react and perform and behave in such a way. And if we now turn back to the life of Joseph, we see that that was his MO. That's how he worked, and that was noticed and recognized, and then certainly an individual, whether they're a Christian or not, is going to look at that and say, I want to surround myself with people like that. I want those that are willing to work hard, put in a little extra effort, look out for my best effort, or my best needs, and those of the people around him. So we see that he was recognized. Let's turn back to Genesis chapter 39 and verse 3. Verse 3 tells us, now his master saw that the Lord was with him. So Potiphar recognized something in this young man. Saw that the Lord was with him and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So again, as you think back to that Matthew 25, and I've given you a few things to do, and you know what? Things are cleaner, things are better organized, things are never lost, nobody's stealing from me. Everything I give to you is done well. And you're taking care of my stuff the way I would take care of my own. And so he's recognized for those qualities. It really becomes a win-win situation as Potiphar says, you know what, Joseph, when you're blessed, by extension I'm blessed, and therefore I'm going to give you more and more and more to control. It goes on to say, and it came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house, this is Potiphar making Joseph the overseer, and over all that he owned, in fact, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned, in the house and in the field. And so, brethren, we can get down each day as we ask our Father for guidance and direction and protection and blessing on ourselves and on those around us and for the rest of his children and for our employers. And as God does that, to say, you know what, you've been faithful over a little. I'm going to give you an opportunity to take on more responsibility and do greater things and get outside of your comfort zone, to stretch your education and to stretch your experience. And when you succeed at it, your boss succeeds, and he likes that, and he will then expand it more. So we have the opportunity, when we're willing to put our best foot forward and to look at the role models that we have in God's Word and say, you know what, I'd prefer to take the bottom off of some of the lows that Joseph went through, but I want my life to mirror that. I want to learn those things. I want to stretch my comfort zone. I want to be capable of more. I want to be that one that God comes to and says, well done, faithful servant. You've been faithful and you've been effective and you've been productive and efficient with a little. I'm going to give you more. Those are the things that we pass on to our children, the lessons that we teach them, that they don't have to learn all of that from scratch. And hopefully we also leave a bit of a legacy that helps our children in the next generation as well. That's biblical. That's consistent with those role models we want to follow. So we should be working at that. It doesn't say life is going to be all rose petals, but we should be working at that and showing that kind of character and that kind of effort. In verse 6 it goes on to say, so he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. We're going to see that same type of thing when Pharaoh puts him second in command. But this was the first stage. This was the learning ground. This was that first level of true responsibility for a relatively young kid who now has access to all his property, all his goods, his businesses. And Potiphar says, you know what? I'm comfortable that you got it all under control. I can run and do and plan and go and travel, and I just worry about getting up every day and having breakfast and that type of thing. Brethren, are we the type of servants, the type of employees? Are we the type of neighbors and friends and disciples that are that faithful, that hardworking, that role model for the next person? We should be the type of people and becoming the type of people that will be emulated by others. Are we role models, as we can see that in Joseph? Point number 5, a blessing with an ugly twist. Point number 5, a blessing with an ugly twist. Sometimes, again, we'll talk about this several times, how a blessing has potentially a dark side. But again, what it does is, as we peak, and then now it takes a twist. Now it expands our comfort zone. Now it pushes us to greater experience. And it takes time for us to step back and evaluate the situation and say, why am I here? Father, what can I learn? Why have you put me in this situation? I believe my life is fully in your hands, and I've submitted it to you that way. And therefore, every twist and turn that happens is at your command, at your decision for my benefit. All things work together for good. And I may not see it in the moment. I may not appreciate what I'm experiencing in the moment. But Father, you're going to work good in me, increase in me, improvement in me, vision, insight, whatever that might be. If I follow you, if I stick close to you, and if I give you credit for all of it along the way. We read at the end of chapter 39 and verse 6 that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Now let me interpret the King James for you. In today's world, he would have been a looker. He would have been a hottie. You know, he's one of those guys that would have been on the front of GQ magazine. And that type of thing gets us noticed in the physical world, and not always in a good way. Because what could have been or should have been, and generally is recognized as a blessing, turned out to be trouble when he caught the eye of his master's wife. So here's Potiphar saying, you know what, guy? You got free reign. Come and go as you please. Make decisions as you see fit. All I worry about is me. And yet you really know that there's always that physical side that's seeing things, and that jealous side and all. And so we see that it comes here. In verse 7, we see that Potiphar's wife asked Daniel, she says, lie with me. Or not Daniel, excuse me, Joseph. But he refused, and then he said, how can I do this great wickedness? So now we step back and say, all right, wait a minute. In this physical world today, many people would say, look, I'm the second in command. I'm the vice president of this house. I'm not going to put that at risk. But that would have been the selfish side, just to say, I'm looking out for number one. What we see Joseph say is, how can I do this wickedness? He understood what was right and what was wrong. And so it truly was from a standpoint of righteousness that he reviewed this, rather than a standpoint of, looking out for number one. So when we stop and we think and we see this all and we look deeply and carefully at it, we see that there's a lot of character here. And again, this still a relatively young guy. How could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So Joseph knew what was right and wrong, and he unquestionably turned away from it. We go on to read in the story that she persisted, even daily it said, and eventually one day Joseph entered the house not realizing that no one else was there, and so he had no insulation, if you will, no protection by having someone else there. Potiphar's wife grabs him and says, lie with me, and she really demanded it. And so she physically grabbed a hold of him, and he slid out of his jacket at that point and ran for the hills, as he knew was appropriate. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18 instructs us to flee sexual immorality, and Joseph took that to heart and carried it out literally as he ran from the house. Brethren, perhaps some of us or some of those people we know have had a similar situation at work. There's the situation where somebody will say, yeah, that person doesn't seem qualified, I bet they slept their way to the top. Brethren, opportunity comes very often to say, well, if you'll just come out golfing with us on Friday evening and then have dinner and some drinks and all that type of thing, come on, rub elbows with the big guys to get ahead. There's opportunity for us to soften our standards. To say, well, Father, I'll go to church tomorrow morning, and I know sundown was the beginning of the Sabbath, but just give me a few hours. You might not realize how important this is to my future. Brethren, we need to flee those situations. We need to put our feet down, we need to put our hands out, and we need to recognize that first okay makes the second one so much easier. And so we need to stand our ground. We need to be that person of character and integrity each and every day of our lives. Some of the issues we face, brethren, some of the experiences we encounter will test us to see if we'll do that. We need to flee those situations, whatever they are. And so again, as we look at our situation and say, have I been in something that I can equate to one of the facets of Joseph's life? And if I haven't been, let me be proactive. Let me sit as I read this and study, because we know that study and prayer and then meditation on these things, to say, well, wait a minute, what if I were in that situation? It's easy for us to just go along and say, no, I'm good here, I'm strong enough. But really to sit and say, how much further? How might somebody package something to get me to lighten up or loosen up? And so we can meditate on those things and make sure that we're prepared. Role play in our minds to say, Father, please, you say you will not try me beyond my capacity. But I need to be prepared, because you might take me right up to the edge of it, and help me to be prepared. If we haven't prepared, we don't know where that line is. And so if we pray and we study and we fast to make sure we're strong enough, we're told that's what we need to do. Those are the ingredients, the stepping stones, the training steps that we take to be prepared. Point number 6. Point number 6, we talked about it taking a turn, and a couple of times we talked about the fact that he's going up that first big grade, and then his brothers attack him, and okay, he's nosed over, and he's starting to feel the rush and the pain maybe, the anxiety, and then you hit the low. Here's a second one. After the wife kicks in, now comes the jealous husband. So point number 6 is the jealous husband. Now again, if we will go back and consider what's come up here for some period of time, I didn't really look at how long this was, but Potiphar has said, you know what, my life has been spectacular. It's been blessed. The herds are growing, my business is doing well, my house is in order because of this kid. And I have constantly turned over more and more opportunity to him. And yet, despite that trust, despite that blessing, there was a point here where Potiphar still had that jealous bone in his body. So verse 19. We see when that jealous husband gets home, it says, verse 19, now it came about when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, this is what your slave did to me, that his anger burned. And we see that Potiphar's wife at this point had concocted the lie, whether out of spite for Daniel, or excuse me, I keep mixing them up, for Joseph having spurned her, or whether she was worried that maybe somebody else had seen. And so, you know what? At this point, she's setting things up to protect herself. And so she tells the story, which is obviously is a lie. Verse 20, so Joseph's master took him and put him into jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. So again, you have a trial that's been foisted upon you. It's got him nervous. He has to run. He may figure that he's safe, and yet suddenly he finds that a lie is concocted against him, and he finds himself in jail. So it's an ugly turn of events because of a very unrighteous wife and then a naturally jealous husband. Again and again, we see Joseph's hopes shattered, and our lives may not descend to the depths that Joseph's life did. But again, do we see that as a role model? Do we recognize that from every situation like that we can learn? Whether it is we're to learn patience, whether we're to learn greater opportunity to hold our tongue. In many workplaces I know, I work at a blue-collar place, and yes, in the office side of things, but people are swearing like sailors each and every day. And when you hear that, some of it just sinks in, and it may be contrary to you. But in a moment of weakness, in a moment of anger, do we slip? So again, what is it that we're supposed to learn? We don't always know, but we ask God to make sure that through the role models that we see, what did lessons say we can learn by study, or we can experience it ourselves. And here in the life of Joseph, we see so many lessons that we can learn from him and prayerfully not make ourselves. Point number 7. So now we find that Joseph is in jail. Point number 7 is that he comes up smelling like a rose. So despite some of these lows, God dusts him off every time, and he helps him turn the corner. He helps him turn direction or whatever it is, but opportunities come. Verses 21 and 23. Verses 21 through 23 show us that God once again was leading Joseph's life to fulfill a plan that God had for him. It says again, as we read earlier, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph. It's the same language that was used back when we saw him first arrive in Potiphar's house. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So you can imagine that the warden at this point is, they're usually a pretty crusty character. They're dealing with the worst of the worst. And so they're not looking to do any favors. They're not looking to help anybody out. They're assuming that everybody is guilty, and so that's what we generally see in a warden or the main guards. But he gave him favor in the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever they did, it was his doing. So we see very much the same situation where God has said, maybe Joseph didn't quite learn or see it as boldly and personally as he should when things happened that way in Potiphar's house. He may have still been young enough that he said, you know what, it's my education, it's my logic, it's my hard work, it's my long hours. What was it King Nebuchadnezzar said? Do you see these gardens that I have done? Maybe Joseph still had some of that pride in him. And so God says, I'm going to take you up there. Bang! I'll knock it out of you. But I'm going to let you see it again. And at some point, sometimes we need that second and that third turn to really get it and to get it clearly. Again, the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority. What did Potiphar say? Dude, you got it. All I worry about is what I eat. It goes on to say, because the Lord was with him, just the way it opened up. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So, regardless of the basements that he finds himself in from time to time, he climbs the ladder over and over again by his dedication, certainly his hard work, his wisdom, his discernment, his understanding, but by God's providence, God's prosperity, he climbs that much faster. Despite the fact that Joseph is one of the dips of the roller coaster, we clearly see that God is constantly in the car alongside him. Point number 8. Again, we've got a number of subpoints, if you will, to this first one that talks about perseverance. When we see ourselves on a high, we want to enjoy it for all that it's worth. We want to get all the benefit from it that we can. When we see the tide start to turn, buckle yourself into that car because you're going to ride it out. Say, Father, walk with me, protect me, guide me, teach me, bless me. And if the blessings are a little reduced for the time being, I'm cool with that because I've left my life in your hands and I know that you're going to make it work. And ultimately, we know that we've got a better place to go. And so what happens to us in this particular life is something that we have to roll with. Point number 8. You see that God foretells the future through Joseph. So here's another opportunity as he's in prison as God has controlled and blessed and led his life, we see that Joseph gives credit. Joseph recognizes the blessings that God has given him, and he vocally makes sure that everybody else recognizes them as well. Turns out, as it said earlier, that he was in prison, and it said earlier, let me go back there, and said in verse 20, so Joseph's master took him and put him into jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Remember earlier we listened to Jamison, Fawcett, and Brown, where it said that throughout his life we see that God put him in the right place to develop for the next step. So Potiphar's house would have been close enough to Pharaoh's court that he would have heard the banter of the day. He would have understood who the players were and who the powers were and who the neighboring countries, whether they were in good stead with him or not. So we would have heard those type of things. And we see now that he's in that type of prison. And again, he's put alongside some people that are going to play into the course here. These two individuals, turns out to be the baker and the butler, if you will, that had fallen on bad terms with Pharaoh, and so they were in with Pharaoh's prisoners. And Joseph found himself there. And when they were troubled, Joseph noticed. So even in a tough situation where he's in prison, he's aware of his surroundings. And he sees the long face. He sees the worried hearts of these individuals. And he takes notice. And he shows compassion. And he asks them what it is that's troubling them. And so again, God puts him in a position. If you look at this puzzle and you look at all the steps that ultimately lead to the end of the story, it's really an amazing ride that Joseph goes through that we can learn from. Joseph goes on to inform them that God has given him the gift of discernment, of interpretation of dreams. And so he asks them to say, tell me what it is. Tell me what's worrying you. And I'm confident that God has given me this blessing and this opportunity, and I can put it to use at his blessing for you at this point. It must have been pretty impressive when they told him the story and he told him how it was going to turn out, and then indeed it turned out just that way. Of course, unless you're the baker, he wasn't particularly pleased because he came out on the short end of the stick, but nonetheless they saw the reality from some nebulous concept that bothers them at night. They get a clear definition of it through Joseph, and it plays out just exactly that, and how impressive that must have been at that moment. Now, knowing the butler is going to be released, Joseph asks for nothing in return. He doesn't say, okay, that'll be $50. But he does say, please don't forget me. When things turn around for you, when you have the ear of Pharaoh, when you're released from this place that we've now spent some time together in, please please remember me and do me that favor as I would have done and already have done for you. Genesis chapter 40 and verse 14, we read about what Joseph's request was. Genesis chapter 40 and verse 14, it says, "Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you." Brethren, we may have said that with somebody we work alongside. We see somebody that got a promotion and we're saying, don't remember or don't forget those of us down here on the floor. We put a lot of time together. I helped you paint your house. I helped you move or whatever. Remember, us little guys down here when you're in the right place. He goes on to say, "Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me the kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon." So Joseph's got to be looking at things right now and saying, you know what, this guy is, he's going from a loser to a star in a matter of a few moments as he goes topside and moves back into Pharaoh's court. And he's got to be thinking that he's about to get released, and he can smell that apple pie cooking on Dad's windowsill already as he envisions going back home after these years away. Point number 9, though, you could write down a short memory. A short memory. Again, recognize that Joseph's at the bottom. He's been blessed while he's in prison. He's been given opportunity to lead and to manage. And yet, he said, do me the favor. And his expectations start to climb. And we see them dashed once again because of a short memory. Point number 9. Verse 23 says, "And yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph." Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. You can imagine as the days dragged on that Joseph must have been crushed. If we read ahead into Genesis chapter 41 and verse 1, and we'll get there in a little while, but it tells us that Joseph spent 2 more years in prison. So this was not a short memory lapse. This was an extended period as this individual went back about his business and forgot Joseph. Joseph may have been sitting there at this point wondering, has God forgotten me? Brethren, I think almost all human beings, almost all Christians, knowing that this is going to be a life of trials from time to time, have sometimes asked that question. If they haven't actively done it, it's somewhere in the back of our mind saying, "Father, have you forgotten me? This has gone on a little bit longer. I think I've learned the lesson that you intended. Have you forgotten me? Hello?" You know how that goes. A little help here. For 10 years, if we go through the time frame, we see it's been about 10 years that Joseph has been riding this whirling, mind-buzzing, up and down, crazy turn of events type of life. And he's still sitting in prison now for 2 more years. But he remembers to leave his life in God's hands as God works out the plans that we see come to fruition in just a couple more chapters. Literally millions of people will come under his care based on everything he's learning and seeing and hearing and gleaning from this. And he's becoming the stronger role model and a more complete life picture that we have of Joseph that we can try to emulate as we look at somebody with the right attitudes and values and experiences that can help us navigate our lives as well. Each of us has to recognize that, brethren. We're going to have highs and lows. If you this afternoon quietly sit and consider this message and look at your life and say, "Wait, yeah, we've lost loved ones, we've lost jobs, we've been promoted, we've been transferred, we've had opportunity, we got raises, we live in a beautiful neighborhood, a terrible neighbor moved in." I mean, the life does this. And as we ride it, do we come every day in prayer of thanks and then request for the strength to ride the next high and survive the next low? Both of those are part of a Christian life cycle. Point number 10. You might say, finally the big break. We're approaching the end of this first point with all its subpoints. But finally the big break. We talked earlier about how Joseph had been in the home of Potiphar and had learned how to manage. And then he had been put into prison and he had learned how to manage in a very different environment. But think about all the skills that would have been necessary. The ability to listen and discern and evaluate and judge and always have God's truth and righteousness in the background to say, no, I ran from Potiphar's wife despite the fact that there may have been some enjoyable things there. I ran because I know it was wrong. How fast can we run, and do we have our sneakers on when we need to? Because there are times we need to flee. All those things had developed as he matured, and they're all part of the life and the story of Joseph. Earlier I mentioned that Joseph spent 2 years in prison after interpreting the dreams of the baker and the butler, and we can read of that in chapter 41. And chapter 41 is where Pharaoh enters the picture. It says, "Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile." And we won't go again into all the detail. This would turn into a whole afternoon seminar, but we all know the story of the 7 fat cows and the 7 gaunt cows, followed by 7 heads of healthy grain, the 7 heads of thin grain, and the account that Pharaoh gives and how he's troubled by these mysterious dreams. Just like the baker and the butler were while they were in prison. And at that point, finally, someone remembers Joseph. Somebody remembers this guy who was blessed to interpret dreams. He says, wait a minute, I know a guy. Let's go find him. Verses 33 through 36. Well, a little bit earlier than that, we see that Joseph is brought up and he's cleaned up, and he has the opportunity to foretell the future at God's blessing. And in verses 33 through 36, Joseph tells of the interpretation by advising Pharaoh of what the solution is going to be. Not only what the problem is going to be, but how to prepare for it, and how to solve it, and how to keep that country and all its servants, all its members, if you will, as safe and as healthy as possible. So point number 11, the second last point we have under this first major, point number 11 is back on the fast track. So again, we see that not only has he now interpreted the dream, but Pharaoh immediately recognizes that this is a special talent and this is a special guy. And so he puts him back on the fast track. Verse 38 says, "Can we find," this is Pharaoh speaking, he's heard the interpretation of the dream. He knows the challenge that's going to be before them in a little over 7 years. And he says, how do I manage this? Who better to manage it than the guy that's been given the ability to foresee that? And if he can foresee what's coming, certainly that wisdom and that gift can help us prepare for it. So in verse 38, Pharaoh goes on to say, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh was led by Joseph saying, this is a gift from God. He's led to say, well, if you got it, son, I want it working for me. Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? And then verse 39, he goes on to answer that question. "So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are." Pharaoh goes on to say, "Only in the throne will I be greater than you." Remember what Potiphar said? You've got free reign. Run it as you see fit. I'm going to worry just about myself. And Pharaoh says, "Only in the throne will I be greater than you. And see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." So as we see the highs and the lows, we see them get sometimes more extreme, but we see them climb to the level that, again, we sometimes dismiss to say, I'll never be that guy. But how many highs have we seen? How many successes have we seen? How many blessings have we appreciated over the years? Just like that, Joseph goes from prisoner to providence. Point number 12. The final point I'd like to make in this series of events relates to the reacquaintance and the reconciliation of Joseph with his family. And that last point really is about the reconciliation. Because again, as human beings, we can sometimes get embittered by things that happen. Father, I got to believe you've tested me beyond my capacity. I have fallen flat on my face. It seems like I've had more lows than highs. It's human nature to do that type of thing. And so at this point, we could have seen Joseph get to a point where he says, you know what, guys? Anybody who's done me a disfavor over the years, I'm just going to exact my revenge. It's very common for human beings, but we see that Joseph was bigger than that. But again, he saw the beauty and the blessings of God, and he was ready to share that with everybody around him. So let's roll the story back for a moment and summarize what's taken place. We've covered a lot of distance, we've covered a lot of years, and we've covered a lot of ups and downs that were all initially predicated by the acts of those brothers. Joseph, we know, kind of going back and telling the story, Joseph was 17. We know when he was wrenched from what was a pretty comfortable life. It was that first good climb. Everything was successful and happy and healthy. He was 17 at the time. He was sold into slavery, and we know that he was about 30 when he stood before Pharaoh to interpret his dream. So that would make him about 37 at the end of those first 7 years of plenty. All right? So from 17 to 37, he's lived 20 years away from home with many of these highs and lows that were rather extreme, very uncomfortable. And then this, what appeared to them as a worldwide famine, begins. 20 years again since he's been dragged off into slavery, watching his brothers' faces disappear in the dust in the distance behind him. So we won't go into all the detail, as I've said several times already, but through that series of events and those that follow, we see that Joseph's brothers become reunited with him. And we see the situation of repentance. Joseph is revealed to them and the family is reunited. And though Joseph's life seemed to be a total shipwreck so many times, we see the faith and the integrity and the wisdom and the patience and the generosity and the forgiveness that this servant of God has the ability to show toward his brothers. And after having revealed himself, and while his brothers, you can imagine, they stand before the most powerful man other than Pharaoh himself, in a place they've come looking for help, and they find instead the one that they did such a terrible thing to. And you can imagine where they all kind of back up and talk amongst themselves, because we read of it earlier when it says, we saw the distress on him. We have nightmares about what we did to him. And now he stands with our lives in his hands. We see Joseph say the following. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result and to preserve many people alive." So again, here's this young man who is now matured through the miles and the years and has recognized that God has created and allowed and crafted each and every one of those experiences to make him the man he is today, to literally help his family and millions others. As we conclude this point, and I know it's been a long one, we need to recognize that God's path to eternal life doesn't follow the path that mankind thinks of. You know, as we go through this life, you'll compete with others, you'll work alongside others, and they will scramble to make their mark and to steal that crown of opportunity for themselves. It's survival of the fittest, if you will. And yet that's not God's way. We see that God sometimes puts us in some very challenging situations. Well, what he blesses is the humility, the tenacity, the patience, the stick-to-itiveness that says, Father, I fully accept the fact that you're in charge of my life, and I ask that you continue in the best way you see fit, because sometimes my vision is a bit cloudy. Each of us, brethren, will face those challenging times. But we can read in James chapter 4 and verse 10, it says, "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up." Sometimes, again, that's James chapter 4 and verse 10, sometimes he will humble us. Sometimes the question is, can we humble ourselves? When we're on that high and we're feeling pretty good about ourselves, can we still get on our knees each day and say, Father, you've put me here. Help me to recognize, to not be King Nebuchadnezzar, who takes it upon himself as, look what I've done. To say, yeah, Father, I've worked hard, but it's through your providence, through your blessing, that I've truly achieved all this. Thank you. Please keep it coming. But when I turn that next corner, when I peak that next and head down that next slope, give me the strength and the humility, Father, to accept that just as I do the highs and to learn from all of it and help it to build a stronger me so that I become one of those role models for other people. Joseph had a solid grasp on the fact that God had been evident throughout his life, and he'd been faithful through all of it, through even the most trying of times. When we're guided by God's comforting spirit and we remain focused on the hope of eternal life, we learn as Joseph did, and then we can learn the lesson that we read of in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, where it says, all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So when we see that purpose in our life, when we truly believe that that target of eternal life is standing out there waiting for us, then we race toward it. Through the highs and the lows, but we race toward it, never taking our eyes off of that, never letting ourselves become embittered as Joseph's brothers did, and as Joseph could have. So that was point number 1, brother. Point number 2. The next 2 points that I'm going to make are relatively short, but again, what we're looking at is the role model of Joseph. And say, do we, as we approach the highs and lows, the opportunities and the trials, do we mirror or model ourselves after one of the best examples that we have? Point number 2 would be, let God work in and through you. Brethren, we know that we can read Scripture that says, don't necessarily make your plans. Well, yes, we're supposed to make plans, but we have to recognize that God's providence, God's hand will be in there, and He'll make those plans better for us if we accept that. And so, instead of hiding sometimes from those challenges and those trials, what did we hear from Mr. Phelps? Push yourself outside that comfort zone. Take the opportunity to learn something new. I'm a bit of a loner. Some people don't find that easy to believe because I stand up here and I speak pretty comfortably, but I just assume be in the woods with a chainsaw, whistling my own tune. For me to walk into a group and stick my hand out and say hello to everybody, to be standing at the door and to introduce myself to new people, I'm not the first person to put myself in that situation. So many of you are more friendly, more naturally outgoing and open than I am. I have to push myself to do that. It's a role I have to take on, and I need to for my own benefit and the needs of others, to show myself more friendly. And so all of us need to find those things that we're perhaps not as strong in and say, what would God want me? If I'm looking at my life and say, is it all a role model? Not so much over here. Not so much over there. Father, help me in those situations where I'm a little weaker. Help me to see some of the brethren that have the strengths that I don't have and say, you know what? I'm going to get right in line behind Joe, because as he sticks his hand out there to say hello, I want to be right behind him, because that's a good example. That's a role model that I can take. Or whoever else it is in here that I see bringing in a big pot of chili. I'm not carrying anything in today. I've got to make sure that I've got a pile of brownies or something next week, because I can do better in so many little ways that help me and help the family and make me a better example to someone else. Brother, we need to make sure that we don't limit ourselves, that we don't look for that quiet corner to live in. Joseph didn't. Moses tried. Father, I'm probably not the guy for this job. Someone else can be your champion. Someone else is more experienced, better looking, better educated, more outgoing. Not me. I'll push the broom over here. Brother, let's not limit God. Let's let God do His work through us each and every day. And when we look at something and say, I'm not real comfortable, but Father, if you're giving me this opportunity, help me to take it. Help me to come out of my comfort zone. Help me to stretch and to learn and to grow. And perhaps to be the person putting my hand out there that somebody else is looking for as a role model next time. Help me to be that person, not to limit you. We see that come out in Joseph's life. We might look at Joseph and say, look at all these great examples. But if you look a little bit further back into the lineage, back into the family background, you're going to see plenty of stuff that's not that great. We know that Joseph was the 12th child of 13, and Jacob had those 13 kids through 4 different women. And if we look back through, you look at what his brothers did to him, it's a constant lifetime of battles and bickering and backbiting. And so, here's this person that becomes one of the role models of the Bible, one of the champions of God's character. And yet, if you look at the background, he had so many opportunities to make excuses, to say, no, it's not me, to be arrogant, to be pompous. And he showed a little bit of that in his life, but ultimately he took the opportunities that God gave him, and he knocked off. God knocked off, and Joseph accepted knocking off those rough edges to become that better role model. Let's make sure we do that. Let's make sure we're not making excuses or looking for an opportunity to hide. That we're looking for a role that doesn't have somebody in it right now that we can serve in some way. That ultimately all brings us to a higher level. Point number 3. So point number 2 was not to limit God, but to make sure that we let Him work through us to stretch our comfort zone, and instead of shying away from it, to be stronger through that. Point number 3 is to make sure that we give credit where credit is due. Give credit where credit is due. And again, we're going to turn back to the life of Joseph, and we're going to recognize some of the things that he did. I've mentioned King Nebuchadnezzar a couple of times already, and remember, it was because of his pride that he was warned. And he managed to back off that particular personality trait for a while, but it reared its ugly head again, and it cost him years of pain and embarrassment, and learning a lesson that ultimately helped him to be even a stronger ruler. But if we give credit where credit is due, we see that in the life of Joseph. He constantly gives God credit, both personally and publicly. From mankind's perspective, we know that when a person lives according to God's way and pursues God and gives God credit, those people will be thought of as odd. And sometimes they'll be ridiculed for it, perhaps. We know that Jesus Christ was persecuted for it. And sometimes, and in some ways, and eventually someday, you'll experience some of that if you haven't already. But God's Word tells us that those same people will be blessed and honored and elevated by God's hand, not only in this life, but more importantly in the world to come. We can read about that blessing in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 26. We're going to be back in Genesis in a moment, so you don't have to turn there if you'd prefer just to stick in Genesis. But in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 26, it says, "And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him will I give power over the nations." And so when we seek God, and we build and we grow and we overcome and we seek Him and we give Him credit, both personally and publicly as Joseph did, we know that we're going to have power and opportunity. That's the kind of perseverance that we saw in the life of Joseph. But let's look back at some of the accounts where Joseph gave credit, where he gave honor and recognition to God. Genesis, you can write these down. I've got, I think, 4 of them real quickly. Genesis chapter 39 and verse 3. This is Joseph in Potiphar's house. And the passage said, "Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand." Now someone who is not godly is going to look at this and say, "Hey, I got a hard-working guy." But how do you see God in Joseph's life unless Joseph gave credit? So through his prayer, and through his study, and through his saying, how is it, Joseph, that everything just goes so smoothly for you? We've got to extrapolate that he, through the servants he interacted with, and right on up to Potiphar's level, he gave credit to God. He said, I am blessed. All things work together for those that seek God. And he made them aware of that. And so it was that Potiphar gave credit to God for those blessings because Joseph had given credit to God for those blessings. Genesis chapter 40 and verse 8, second subpoint here of giving credit where credit is due. This is during the time that he was in prison. You remember here, he reached out to these 2 prisoners that served in Pharaoh's court, and he said, "Guys, what is it that's bothering you?" And they said, "Well, we have these dreams, these nightmares that trouble us." But Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? So tell the dream to me, please, and I'll interpret it, but not me." So he, right up front, he gave credit for the fact that he had a talent, but it wasn't his. It was a blessing that had been given to it. And so word got around of this godly man who had been given incredible blessings. Brethren, are we ready to give credit where credit is due? Genesis chapter 41 and verse 15. Genesis chapter 41 and verse 15. Again, this is Joseph. This time he's standing before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says unto Joseph, he says, "I've heard it said that you can understand a dream and interpret it." Imagine again if somebody of great wealth and great power were standing there and says, "You know what? I understand you have special skills." Yep, I do. So many people will fall to that moment of pride. And yet Joseph put himself behind the situation and said, "It is not in me, but God will give Pharaoh an answer." And so as he maybe one of the other reasons that Pharaoh elevated him so quickly is because he's like, I see a guy here who's not going to put himself, maybe he's going to have an opportunity with some other leader that will come into my country, and Joseph, if I put him second in command, he's going to take credit. But no, I see a guy here that truly knows who he is, what he is, where his blessings come from. And he put God first and gave God credit in front of the most powerful man in the country. Finally, in Genesis chapter 41 and verse 50, we can read in those verses between 15 that we just referred to and verse 50, we read that time passes, we read that Joseph has become married, and he's blessed with 2 sons. And Joseph names the first one Manasseh. And the scripture goes on to say, in quotes, "For he recognized that God had made him to forget all his trouble in his father's household." So, when we often name our children today, we something catches our ear, what the most popular name is that particular year. But we see that Joseph here gave thought to the fact that as he picked a name for his son, he thought of God, and he thought of the blessings, and he thought of the deliverance and the providence that he had had. And it says he recognized God and named him Manasseh because he recognized that God had made him to forget all the trouble in his father's household. Those difficult times during the early part of the years, or his life, he had been blessed. And he had been able to put those things down and behind him and say, yes, Father, thank you so much. And I give you credit through the name of my son. It goes on to say in his second son, he names Ephraim because, again, God had made Joseph fruitful, even in the land of his affliction. So in the very personal and private time of naming his babies, he also gave credit to God and recognized all that God had done. And so he chose a name that he would call out every single day that would reinforce the fact that each of them was a blessing, and his life in general had been a blessing. So notice that in every step of his life, Joseph worked powerfully, or God had worked powerfully through Joseph, and Joseph had given him credit. God had always been in the forefront of Joseph's thoughts. Brethren, let's each one of us make sure that we give credit where credit is due. Sometimes when we get down and pray and we buzz over the things that we've been given and we've got to hurry up and shave and shower and run off to work, but do we take special time to say, Father, in so many ways, in every step of my life, as I consider the role models that others have been, and as I am a husband or a wife or a father or a mother or an employee or a supervisor, I have an opportunity to be a role model. And I need to make sure that my life mirrors Joseph and the credit that he gave and always points people toward you. We don't get on the PA system at work and preach that way in order to give that credit, but we do it in quiet ways to those that God is leading to see something special, or to question, why is it that you do what you do? Why don't you rub elbows with us on a Friday night? Well, I have other commitments. I have a very dear and deep understanding that God has said that's special time to him, and so I don't share it with others. You want to do it on a Sunday afternoon or evening? I'm all there. But this is special time that's been set aside that I understand and I believe. And people say, well, you know what? You didn't slap me with it, that I'm a pagan. You didn't tell me I can't do what I want to do. But you've planted a seed by your example and by your kind and wise words that might percolate for a long time in that particular mind. We have an opportunity to be a role model in so many ways to others. Every day we have the opportunity to give God credit for what's in our lives. Brethren, as I read through the late chapters in Genesis, and as I looked for references on this, I came to realize that there are more chapters devoted to the story of Joseph than to Abraham or Isaac or anybody else. What we have here is a long, thorough, meandering story about somebody who should be a role model to us. Someone whose values and attitudes and example and character is something that we should strive to emulate, to model, or to mirror. There's a book entitled Joseph, and in it, I think I skimmed over it for time earlier, But it says that Joseph, probably more than any other Old Testament character, demonstrates the mind of Christ. In quotes, it says the mind of Christ. And what's even more startling is that this exemplary lifestyle predates by hundreds of years the revelation of God's law. It says he is indeed a model Christian in the Old Testament. And so we can see it uses the term model. Is he a role model for us? Joseph's struggles, his heartaches, his temptations, his decisions, and his victories all speak to us today as a shining example of how a true Christian should live their life. To accept the lows, to thrive on the highs, and to make sure that we have the opportunity to teach and to train and to share and to give credit for our life as an example of God's providence. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from the study of the life of Joseph. The topics range from his immaturity to leadership, from self-control to shrewd business, and from spiritual tenacity to humility. All of them come out in different places, and generally in the right place as we look at the life of Joseph. And so as we look at our life, are we exhibiting those same type of talents, those same type of qualities? And again, we may be a more quiet individual, a little bit of an introvert, but the question is, in the opportunities that we have, in the time that we have, in the interactions that we have, whether it be with our children, whether it be with a coworker or a neighbor, are we exhibiting what would be considered the role model life that we should, given the way God has called us and drawn us and developed us down through the years? Let's strive to develop the strength and the depth of the faith that Joseph exhibited throughout his lifetime, recognizing that our true strength comes from God and from accepting his guiding presence in every step of our life.